allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene. Si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Bentrovati a
Welcome everybody. There are so many of you. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the meeting for having invited me here to be here with you to look at a time that seemed so long ago, but maybe isn't so far away. And this will be explained and described. I read these drafts of the book a long while ago, which has accompanied me over this summer, and which really made me wonder, amazed me for its relevance of a time back in 1968, that sort of period when many of us weren't born or were only young, that's so close in many aspects to what we're living today. Apart, obviously, to hear the accent of an educator, of a teacher, a theologian, who continues to amaze us with his authority in judgments, his passion, the curiosity with the way he looked at reality itself, the tenderness with which he accompanied persons, people, but also for a positivity in how he looked at things, We often think of the times we're in as being difficult, and even back then there were certainly once simple times, both in political and social and ecclesial levels. And then it's interesting how this obedience, this tenacious obedience, that was certain in the church, in the company of his friends that he'd put together in those years. So here with us we have Linda Giussani. I think perhaps you're expecting Father Cardinal Farrell, but at the last moment he was unable to come. Linda Giussani, who's the Undersecretary at the Dicastery for the Lay People, Family and Life. She's a philosopher, a theologian, and a lawyer. And is here naturally not just to bring the Cardinal's words to us, but also to bring her own words and her own presence from the Dicastery. Davide Prosperi, you all know, he's the president of the Fraternity of Communion and Liberation. He's a university teacher of biochemistry in the University of Milano in Bicocca. Sergio Belardinelli, sociologist and student of politics. He's formerly a teacher at the University of Bologna, and we very gladly read his editorials in the folio. And Alberto Savorana, I think you know as well, he's in charge of the publishing activities of Communion and Liberation, and also was the author, the editor of A Monumental Life of Father Giussani. So I'll hand over to you first. Thank you all. I have a very simple task. I'll offer a few sketches to get into what the meeting called the 1968 of Don Giussani, and so the interventions of the speakers that have been announced. I'll start like this. As a young man, when he was only 15 years old, Don Giussani was thunderstruck by the realization that Christ was the center of all reality, and the response to all of human questions. That he was the realization of every desire of happiness, of eternity, of an eternity that's present in the human heart. The wonder and the attraction of this first encounter with Christ never abandoned him. Maybe some of us can remember those are the words with which Pope Francis, in October 2022 in Piazza San Pietro, when he celebrated the centenary of the birth of Don Giussani. I read them because they seem to introduce in the most adequate way to the life of Don Giussani in that moment that was so marked by the explosion of the contestazione, a kind of uprising. So I had a particular opportunity, was that to immerse myself daily in the great sea of the unpublished texts of Don Giussani. And I'll never be sufficiently grateful for this, firstly to Don Giussani, who started everything, and then to Don Caron, and now to Davide Prosperi, who have renewed in me, have renewed the trust in me and the faith in me to continue this work of excavation. So there are some interventions of Don Giussani, really from those particular years, that seem to me a very clear documentation of that observation of Pope Francis, because in these we see clearly the importance of the figure of Christ and the encounter with Christ that he did when he was young and in his years at seminary. And you see this importance really in what Giussani defines the biggest shock that the movement had encountered, that the movement suffered, when Giovane Studentesca basically halved in a few days, when many people abandoned the movement to adhere to the student uprisings. And so, thanks to these unpublished texts, I was able to go over these times from the 68, 69, almost brought by hand by Don Giussani, discovering, and I think we'll hear this in the speaks, the real pertinence and relevance of those words of his for today, for the life of the movement and also the life of the church. And still, back in 2022, the Pope recalled that times of crisis are a paradoxical opportunity for a critical discernment, a humble renewal, and a recovering, reviewing. And so in these texts of Don Giussani that go over this period, we are encouraged in this work of discernment and renewal and recapitulation. How did he do it? He did it dialoguing with a group of young people who were mostly undergraduates or new graduates who in 1964 had founded the cultural centre Charles Péguy in Milan to continue living the faith as an experience that they had experienced in their years in school. The transcripts of 6 of these lectures, if you like, make up the key of the revolution of self, life as communion, which is the book that Rizzoli has just published recently, and which in some way dictates the agenda of what we're going to talk about. So what do you see in this text? Above all, that Giussani doesn't waste time moaning that the world is changing or is falling apart. He does something else. He describes the faith and that he retains that those young people must rediscover, re-find, to face that historical moment that was so dramatic. And he does it doing a kind of work of personal conversion, not certainly with respect to the content of his faith, but which was indeed deeply rooted, but to the way of communicating it in a time that was changing profoundly. In this way, I'll tell it to you because I think it's really important, this episode. We were back in the summer of '68. Giussani went down to Milan. He met a group of young people from Rimini, from GS. There were few of them in the parish house of a little place here, nearby, in Torello, in the hills near Rimini. The few sort of survivors of a general hemorrhaging. And dialoguing with them, he realizes a sign of the times. He recognizes a sign of the times. That it's no longer discourse about tradition, which can be the foundation of belonging to the Christian fact. And this is surprising, that in that same summer, a cardinal called Joseph Ratzinger published his book, The Introduction to Christianity, in which he says, it's no longer the framework of tradition that can be the foundation of man. Man does not feel at home within the framework of tradition. A faith that comes to him under the label of tradition must appear to him as something outdated. And Don Giussani, so where does he restart from? To launch the challenge of Christianity to young people in '68. He starts from what had conquered him, from that encounter that had taken his life, that event, which isn't a doctrine, it's not a discourse, as Pope Francis said so many times, going back over what Benedict XVI said, but it's an event with a person, Christ. So the encounters with Péguy that go out that are set out in Revolution of Self, they see Giussani engaged, digging down into the words to try to make emerge that eternal original nucleus and to repropose it to the young people, to that group of young people in the midst of this ocean of revolt. There's a word, along with the revolution of self, this recentering to the original nature of the Christian subject. Through all the pages of the book, you see it, and it's the page. It's the word communion. The involvement of your life in my life and of mine in yours. This communion isn't my wishing or your will, but it's the event that Christ brought into the world, the mystery of the church to which we belong, in the environment of which we have been struck. So this is the task. I'll conclude. And Giussani indicates these people, Piggy, as a response, a single response, an adequate response to 68. Communion is, and liberation, he would say, without having planned it. There comes up a dynamism from the end of 69 that life is communion and liberation, which is above all a surprise for Don Giussani. It was in fact in those months that we older people, we were given to the universities who had started to give out a leaflet in the State University of Milan entitled Communion and Liberation. And this was the proposal that Giussani formulates in 68, and that I think has a lot to do with our time today. The encounter with Christ, the friendship with Jesus, which in the communion, the lived communion, changes your life and makes you experience the value, the human worthwhileness of Christian faith, wherever, so Giussani says, wherever we might be, whether you're on the square or in a prison, whether you've got a broom in your hand or a pen for writing.
Grazie Alberto Savorana.
Thank you, Alberto Savorana. Professor, a friend was saying to me this morning, someone who was there at the time, that in the walls of the Centro of the Piggy Center, there was something written, building the church is freeing man, is liberating man. Maybe that's where the name came from, but please, go ahead. Thank you, Monica. So to everybody, I'm very happy to take part in the mini meeting. A meeting in this edition which has so much to do with the searching for the essential, and to take part in this particular meeting, which looks at the text that we've heard in the words of Alberto, that concentrates itself on the essential as it emerges in the texts that are gathered up in the volume, the essential, which was at the foundation of what Don Giussani gave life to, along with a company of friends, to communion liberation. I'm really sad that the prefect of the Dicastery, Cardinal Farrell, can't be here. And he's also upset about the impossibility of being able to take place, and he asks me to bring his greetings to everybody, his closeness, his esteem, and to ensure you of his prayers for all of the organizers, for the volunteers, and for everybody who's taking part, who's here at the meeting. He assures you of his prayers for all the good fruits with which the Lord wants to bless this meeting. From my side, in reading this, I'll stick faithfully to the text that the prefect gave and decided to share with you this evening to present this wonderful volume that this meeting is all about.
In 1968, Western society was traversed by the phenomenon of contestation of student riots, which in various ways and on several occasions changed habits, behaviors, values, and our very way of thinking, tracing a deep furrow between what came before, the society of our fathers, of authorities, of tradition, and in the present, to which hopes for a new future were inextricably linked. Even the Catholic Church, less than 3 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council, was filled by movements contrary to the traditional customs and forms, in a spirit defined as renewal, which called into question and launched situations of crisis in ecclesial life considered insufficient and inadequate to understand and face the needs and signs of the times. In some cases, student protests brought together these two instances: anti-authoritarianism and libertarianism on one hand, and innovative evangelicalism on the other, in a sort of unease and rebellion, not always clear, but nonetheless not at all irrelevant, as in the case of the occupations of the Catholic University of Milan, which started the spread of student protests throughout Italy. The Catholic world was deeply shaken by the events of those years, from parishes to religious orders, from traditional lay associations to new forms of ecclesial community. Student youth itself, Gioventù Studentesca, began its experience in Milanese schools by Father Giussani. Many of its adherents, amongst of them several leaders or appointees, saw in student movement, as Alberto Savorana reminded us, they saw in it the full realization of the ideals previously pursued and professed, abandoning the experience first made in student youth in GS, to throw themselves into political commitment, increasingly inspired after an initial libertarian phase by Marxism. In this situation, Father Giussani resumed with the decision the relationship with the student youth. In the meantime, they'd grown up, and they'd remained faithful to the original experience they'd had, and had continued to meet each other thanks to the Peggy Cultural Centre, a free cultural association founded in October of '64 to promote an authentic culture and a dialogue between the various ideological forces. The texts collected in the volume A Revolution of Self, Life as Communion, contain dialogues, lessons from commencement days and spiritual exercises of the years from 68 to 70 with the adherents of Piggy. They document live Father Giussani's attitude and action in today's civil and ecclesial life, and are a precious testimony to understanding how a movement is born and reborn. From the very pages of the volume, the intention that as an attitude and conscience animates Father Giussani is clear. External difficulties, social, ideological, behavioral, are not something to defend oneself from, but are rather occasions to grow in faith. That is, he tells his former high school students that the moment to face the problem of the maturity of faith, that's what that moment was, the position of the adult Christian in history. Thus, the invitation in the first text to come to an understanding on the content of the Christian experience takes on vigor. The purpose of today's gathering is to come to an understanding on the implementation of that vision. So important is this approach that Father Giussani makes the possibility of continuing to participate in this nascent movement depend on it. He says, "I personally believe that I can continue in the collaboration between us only insofar as this physiognomy, indicated by the contents I will now recall, is saved." The two pillars of the Christian conception subsequently considered acquire in this light an extraordinary importance, being the reason for coming together and at the same time outlining the face and position of the Christian in the world. First, the Christian life as a communion, and second, the collaboration in the events of the world, of the cosmos. These are, emphasizes Father Giussani, the two pivotal points, exhaustively such, of our conception. These are the 2 points, full stop. Now, the genius of Father Giussani is to sustain the profound unity and correlation of these 2 pivotal points. Life as communion, in fact, tends to embrace the world, to make it a habitable home for all. And Similarly, collaboration for the betterment of the world passes through lived communion. On the contrary, the separation of the two pivotal points would easily lead to closing oneself off in communities no longer founded on faith and Christian maturity, or to thinking about changing the world and committing oneself to it, assuming principles and schemes that have nothing to do with the Christian proposal. And this has been a separation from which the Christian world has suffered, almost to this day. He warns that these two pivotal points not only delineate the face of a new Christian presence in society, this will be the novelty, not always well understood, of the experience of communion and liberation in Italian society starting in '69, and then in the following years in various parts of the world. But they directly invest the question, a hotly debated one, in the relationship between the church and the world. The following chapters are in fact dedicated to clarifying from within personal and community experience the incidence of these 2 points on the physiognomy and the face of the Christian, on his vocation and the value of his commitment, on the church's presence in the world, and on the relationship between Christian experience and human experience. With simple but precise wording, Father Giussani offers his answer to the question. The relationship between the church and the world is all, in my opinion, traceable to this relationship between the truth of our immanence in the event of the word of Christ, Christian communion, and the cordial, passionate loyalty with which we are within the demands and needs of mankind. Try to think, how can we be within mankind's needs and requirements if we are not serious, loyal, passionate, and attentive to ourselves? From the understanding and realization of this relationship depends the witness and contribution of Christians in society, or, in other words, the value of the Church's mission in the world. To understand this mission, Giussani radicalizes the Christian discourse, taking it to its origin, that is, to the essence of Christianity. To the young people swept up by the winds of protest, he does not propose a Christianity to defend, but a Christianity to live as an event. Indeed, Giussani asks, how did Christianity arise? How did it begin? It was an event. Christianity is an event. The word event, avvenimento in Italian, recurs often in the text and qualifies in a strict sense the itinerary of a Christian life and vocation. It can no longer be neither history, nor doctrine, nor tradition, nor discourse that moves the man of today, but only an encounter with a presence that is full of proposals and meaning. This event is not a thing or a consequence of antecedent factors, but a novelty that takes place. It is the presence of Christ in history. And the event is prolonged. This event that is prolonged in history is the Church. If the Church's mission is to make Christ present in history, it is understandable why Giussani considers it essential for the Christian's mission in the world to build the Church. And he recalls on several occasions that the Church is built there where one lives, in the workplace, in school, in your family, in neighborhoods, in the city, and the various aspects of social, civil, and cultural life. This mature responsibility of the faith, which undoubtedly enhances the role of the laity in the building of the Church in the modern world, is recalled throughout the book, on several occasions and under different themes. From life as communion to the identity of the Christian, from the faith that invests daily life to the visibility of the Christian community, from the certainty of faith to knowing how to judge facts and situations that affect the men and women of today. In the meetings at the beginnings of the year and in the spiritual exercises, Giussani insists, with ever-increasing conviction and passion, on inviting his friends to collaborate and dedicate their lives to the building of the church, that is, of the newness introduced by Christ in human history. In particular, in chapter 4, it's a lecture on the morning of the 3rd of November of 69, he dwells on our collaboration in the building of the church, the truest way in which we can love the world and its salvation. Giussani says, if Christ is our hope and the mystery of the church is his continuity, the continuity of Christ, then to collaborate in building the church is truly the only way, with which we can think with love about the world. It is the only way with which we can make our life useful to the world. This idea is recalled shortly afterwards with great clarity and decisiveness in these words. To collaborate in building and edifying the church, this is our task, this is the function of our life in the world. We have no other task, we have no other function outside of this. But Giussani does not merely indicate a perspective or clarify an intention. He also wants to indicate a path made up of conditions, criteria, both objective and subjective connotations. In a few pages, Giussani expounds his ecclesiology not in the form of theological treatise, but as a vibrant proposal of life and in a way that's communicable to today's generations. Distinguishing between objective conditions and subjective conditions, Giussani indicates, among the former, two factors which are closely linked. First, the communion of life, which is born from the person changed by the encounter with Christ, and second, the reference of this experience of communion to the community of the total church. There is no building the church if not as a lived community, which involves life in all its aspects. This is the personal initiative which arises from the person. But there is no building the church if not in relation to the whole church, to its authority, life, and structure. Two conditions, says Giussani, that cannot be separated, that are related, that relate dialectically and in tension with each other. Giussani summarizes that there are two things that come from the Christian faith. Conversion, it is what Giussani calls the fundamental sentiment of life, that is, the expectation of the fulfillment of what in life has begun. Giussani expresses it in various ways, among which, for beauty of expression and clarity of participation, I'll give you this one that is found on pages 149 and 150. To the extent that I am so bent on my own good and that of the world, what is the thing that I desire the most? The event that I desire the most, the moment that I desire the most, the phenomenon that I desire the most. The peak of my desires, what is it? Specifically, what is it? The culmination of my desires is what the New Testament calls the return of Christ, the parousia, his coming. We proclaim your death, O Lord, and we proclaim your resurrection until you come again. This is the sentiment that is sensitively, psychologically giving the very soul, the whole inner world of the conscious Christian. Associated with this second fundamental feeling, and we're now talking about the second subjective condition, is a new possession of things, of reality, an inner condition that defines ethics, Christian morality. Picking up on what St. Paul says, Giussani affirms that participating in the Christian event a different way of possessing relationships with me and with things is born to me. It is the theme of possession in detachment, or more clearly, a bold word given the times we live in, of virginity. A word that in Giussani acquires the value of a true and authentic relationship with reality, one's his own and the world's, and that can make one the protagonist of a new human construction. I quote, "It is called virginity in human terms, the new way of possessing things, the new way of possessing oneself, human relationships and things, that together establish the constructive effort of the Church." It's clear that this word, thus recovered, does not represent an alternative to any particular function in life. It is the idea for any function, even if, in the community of the Church, God gives rise to a function that is a paradigm for all, a reminder to all of this ideal for all. In this way, Giussani outlines the face of the Christian, of his collaboration in the building of the Church, and clarifies at its root the intrinsic relationship of an ecclesial movement with the life of the Church as a whole. From this intrinsic relationship, Giussani draws two fundamental consequences. The first concerns the face of the Christian community. He warns that the traditional forms of the Christian community have been put into crisis, and many of them have not stood the test of time. Hence, the need to renew not only their face, but their nature and specific function in the society of the late 20th century and the years that followed. Giussani identified in the construction or reconstruction of the Christian community the fundamental condition of human and social change that the men and women of our time both desire and expect. He understands the deep unease that many, especially young people, feel in the face of an aging church, closed in on itself, conditioned by more or less explicit forms of clericalism, incapable of speaking to people of today, and reduced to a sort of agency of religious feelings and inclination. He, on one occasion, mentions a face of the church that is still far from what it should be, and humanly unattractive, precisely when compared to the values for which it is adhered to. The face, which is another recurring term, is not just about outward appearance, but the method of Christian experience. And it is precisely on this method which the volume offers one of its most precious contributions, not only to understand the soul of communion and liberation and its very raison d'etre, but also to open a serious discussion within the Church on the value and the way of it presents itself in today's world. The idea of a group, an imprecise and only provisionally used term, indicates the proximity of relationships, thanks to which the witness of faith can be nourished and sustained. It was that idea that in his seminary years had fascinated Giussani and some other seminarians who, by founding the Studium Christi, intended to set up somewhere at which they could speak seriously about Christ, to set one's life as a verification of Christ, and to create a web of relationships among companions happy because of this. Linked to this is the second consequence, the idea of a movement. A movement is not simply doing things, having initiatives, building structures like any other association. Rather, for Giussani, it is making present in normal daily life, a life made up of problems, difficulties, expectations and disappointments, revealing the presence of Christ therein, a presence full of proposal, capable of making people face life positively and change it. In 1968, and from then onwards, for all the years that followed, he did not attempt Don Giussani did not attempt to remedy the upheavals of an era and a situation of radical change by simply propping up what could still be saved in order to survive, but rather he set a different point of origin from which to build, to think, to live. This change of self, this revolution of the self, for him stood at the origin of every genuine revolution and every serious change. Subsequent years would show how the changes promised by old men would soon flounder, leading back to the old contradictions and errors that were intended to be fought. But this change of self expresses itself and has its method of realization in communion, a communion that Giussani says invests the whole world of life, from daily and civic affairs, to one's own abilities, to money, to judgment on social, economic and political events, to moral choices, reviving the church and thus making the Christian reality more aware, creating many communities linked to one another that make man's life more human and contribute to a new order of social life. This idea of movement, which was gaining ground in those years, and which this volume helps to understand in its genesis, in its nature, and its prospects, does not specifically concern a single movement, but the very dynamic of the church, in its totality and in its mission, which, as St. John Paul II said, is movement, dynamic and witness to the Christian faith in the life of men. To conclude, I'll hearken back to one of Don Giussani's texts that are contained in this volume, which we're presenting to you, which contains the words of Pope Francis, spoken in St. Peter's Square on the occasion of the audience to the movement on the 15th of October of 2022. Communion and liberation was born precisely in a time of crisis, like 68 was. And afterwards, Father Giussani was not afraid of the moments of passage and growth of the fraternity, but faced them with evangelical courage, entrustment to Christ, and in communion with the Mother Church. Thank you.
Grazie, Professore.
Thank you, Professor Giussani. Other professor, please.
Grazie. Grazie al meeting per avermi invitato. Non so quanto fossero consapevoli dell'invito che hanno fatto.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm not sure how aware they were of the invitation that they made. I'm really very happy to be here. Maybe not just because it's the great opportunity to give a sense of gratitude, to express my sense of deep gratitude, which I've always felt towards Don Giussani and of his movement. Really, in the years in which Don Giussani was speaking and writing these things that we've heard today, I, since then, knowing very little of the movement, I felt a natural sympathy for the themes, the topics, which back then were the topics which were hot topics in the world. And I had the sensation that Don Giussani was facing them in a way that was absolutely unheard of in those times. And because I joined the university in 71, 68. The so-called 68 was a long period in Italy, and so it was still going on. So we all know what were the topics. Today I discovered what were the topics that induced many people from GS to abandon GS. What's most extraordinary, I think, in Giussani, and was back then, and I realise this now, and it's so today, is the capacity that this man had to transform practically a catastrophe into a great opportunity. An opportunity which pushed Giussani onto the essential. We ask ourselves, why do we believe that this comes back many times in the book? We have nothing but Christ. We have nothing except the living presence of Christ. Nothing else to grab onto except him. And Alberto Savorana said rightly that back then it was really clear to Giussani that Christianity had few chances to make itself credible. It had a glorious tradition, nevertheless, despite having a glorious tradition. And Giussani says it explicitly, not even theory is still able to touch the heart of man today. And it's so from this that he bets everything on what? On the person of Christ. He wagers everything on the person of Christ, and on the person of Christ he seeks to build up that which he calls a new self-awareness, which should be then a self-awareness that's founded on communion. A communion with Christ, a communion with the Church, as the foundation of the work of this man. Please let me read a passage about this self-awareness of man, because I think maybe for you it's familiar, but for me it has a real force. It's before any operation, before any structure to build up, before any project to impose, to build, the task that we have to realize is a new self-awareness. That is, a new way of realizing that I am, and that therefore to realize the tools for judgment and action that are totally different. And this is the heart of the discourse of this book. And not just that, but you know that better than I do. This capacity to judge everything that's all new and unheard of, it's got nothing to do with the logics, the wizened logics of the I, or the logic of we, because there's also a small up logic of us. So these slogans that I recall very much from that period, the student movement was a we, as very powerful. I remember practically all the slogans, that some of them were really nice. The imagination of power, that's unforgettable for me. Because the more nicer they were, the more, what could you say, poor, impoverished of thought, really. So Bachelet wrote in some part that a poem can be beautiful, a philosophy can be really bad, even when the poems are good, are beautiful. And those who are old as me really had the experience of beautiful poetry with a terrible philosophy. Giussani, I think, he tries to put a new gaze on this, something that was unheard of, a criterion of judgment on reality that depends totally on another, on a my friend, that he calls it in the book more than once, on Christ. My measure, it says in this book, my measure isn't mine. These are words that resounded in 1968 when they were written. But I think they still sound really amazing today because, like germs pass around in that subjectivism that was a bit soft back in those days. As Benedict XVI could say, they were exclusively to an eye and to its wants. So Don Giussani, with respect to this dominant culture that was starting to be dominant back then and is dominant today, what does he say? He says something that is really provoking, really provocative. The most sublime form of liberty, of freedom, could be the freedom from ourselves. Let's say the highest point that we can reach, reflecting on our freedom, could be gaining the freedom from ourselves, putting ourselves in communion with that other, with that friend, that we have met, the Christian event, the life as communion. How much rubbish less could we have said if we'd been really anchored on this communion? The descriptions of this other that's there in us, there can be many aspects. I said, if the flexing itself as merit, if we were protected from all of that rubbish that's so diffused about identities, the identities of the I, of the identity of Europe, the identity of cultures, the difficulty in encountering the other. I'm me, you scare me. How could we be scared by another if the other is inside me? How can I construct a theory of identity without being aware of this other that I've inside me? How much we know that the problem of Europe deep down. I'll say it with a joke that I hope will be forgiven me, but deep down, Europe needs Christ and needs the church. The rest, as always happens in church, is our great privilege, has been given us in overabundance. All the rest has been given on top. The state of laws, the beauty of our country, all that we know about what we call the European identity, that's great, is an extra that's been given to us for having been and to be Christians. This, I reckon, is an element for optimism, because if the world could fall down, as Benedetto Croce said, if the world falls down, there'd still be materials to do good with. I think that's even a Giussanian thought. We don't need to cry over this. It's not time to cry into our beer, but it's time to be faithful to this inspiration. We don't need to waste our time doing too many pre-planned projects, but it's this other who is within us. Reality then appears to us, will configure itself in a way that will help us to understand what this reality needs from us. We don't need to do too many theories over the top of it. I'll finish on this theme, this topic, even because Alberto, about Don Giussani, he's everything that needs to be said, that we could say. I've still got 3 minutes, and very briefly, very rapidly, 2 minutes now, I'll say 2 minutes. The theme of hope. I was very struck by, I said, in a difficult time, rather than crying, we look at the future. St. Paul says, you needn't afflict yourself as the others who have no hope. Benedict XVI in Spe Salvi says beautiful things in number 2 about the privilege of Christians who have a future. Having future means having a certainty, these are Benedict's words, that our life won't fall into the void. It won't finish in the void. The world, despite everything, the world has a meaning. The world, despite everything, in some ways, is gift, is grace. Good. Giussani speaks of hope as a historical judgment. I'd like to be a bit on this. A historical judgment. Monica says no, so don't let me go on this. I won't go too far. But a historical judgment that has in history and finds in history its confirmation, says Giussani. And more, he also says that it's a historical judgment that Christians realize in peace. This seems almost a random referral, reference, but you need to hear this, that the word hope as a judgment on history is associated with peace. As almost it resounds in a really, really impressive way in our time. And then I'll finish the last one. So hope as something that is not, it doesn't make us hide or covers from our responsibilities, doesn't make us maybe, it doesn't save us from risks of and surprises in life. It's hope that, above all, protects us from fear. This is the true force, the true strength of Christian hope. It protects us from fear. It lets us go in the world, even if the world could fall down with all the bad things, everything that we know could be, and that is. Despite all this, we know that there is a destiny of good. We're all through the communion in Christ. We're all in the house of God. It's not Monica. I have many questions, and I see that. If you want, you can crucify me, but I've got a timekeeper in front of me, and I need to have a question for everybody. So please, David Prosperi, let's go. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to all. Good afternoon. And first thing, I'd like to thank His Eminence, Cardinal Farrell, who couldn't come, but for sending us his intervention. That's really important, very precious. And also thank you to Dr. Giussani for having contributed to share it with us, accepting to be here, accepting our invitation. Also I thank Professor Belardinelli for his words, which we hear as so warmly, we think. There's such warm words, yes, Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Alberto. And thank you all. Okay. Thank you also to the meeting that hosts us, but the meeting is us deep down. So, in the speeches that we've already heard, that make my work a bit easier, because many things, the principal themes have already come out in them. The things that characterize the unpublished works of Don Giussani, unpublished to now. I want to say straight off something that deals with the aim of this publication. Here we delineate quite clearly, in a very effective way, what are the the peculiar traits of the charism. The things he calls that he calls our conception of our discourse, of the charism itself, that was given to him by the Holy Spirit for the good of all of the church. And that we realize that Giussani acquires this awareness straight off from the very beginning, that then this gave an origin to what we all know as the movement of communion and liberation. So, before delving into these peculiar traits that we've described partly by Dr. Giussani, I'd like to express as a brief premise the great enthusiasm, because I share this, the enormous gratitude that has characterized the work that was carried out by the Fraternity of CL to produce this volume. Because in rereading and reorganizing these texts, we were surprised every day by the extraordinary relevance of the content and of their prophetic force, of the words of Don Giussani that was said in those days, in those years. Because the educational concerns and the teachings that Father Giussani expresses in a moment that was, as already said, was particularly dramatic in the history of our country, not just of our country, but even the history of the church, they take on today a significance that's even more important than before, really, in my opinion, even for CL itself. So I'd like to try and focus on some of these constituent factors, the two pillars that Dr. Giussani was talking about, bring them up to the present time. I think there are three aspects of this, three expressions of this that today, going back to make it more important than ever to look at these things. So what are these three things? First, Christian life as communion, judgment and the new culture, and thirdly, life as mission. Inevitably, in taking up step by step what Giussani said, in my speech, it'll contain many quotations taken from this volume. Well, I'll limit myself to tracing a fil rouge to help us to listen to and understand the points. Okay, first thing, first point, Christian life as communion. So here, it's a theme that imposes itself right from the first pages. Giussani starts right off with this. It's not just an editorial choice. This was really, we followed Alberto in collecting up the writings, followed, and all of those who contributed to edit the volume, all followed the chronological way that Giussani was doing these lectures. So it's as if Giussani already had in mind a path to trace. So he followed a bit, he followed the facts to an extent, but it's really, this is important even as a method. So the category of communion is proposed in its universal horizon as well as in its particular one. God did not enter the world as he says, as a divine meteor which ploughed through the sky of history for an instant. God came among us to remain in history in a human sign. The encounter with Christ today occurs through encountering the communion of people related to him, part of him, a contemporary form exactly of his event. So normally this is running into a person or a group of people who have already had this encounter and whose life in some way has already been changed by it, by this. and by the immanence of the Christian communion. They carry this in their way of living and being together, in their gaze and in their movements, the announcement of his presence. I believe that for many of those who are here, this is really what happened. Bumping into this, a human encounter. But if the communion has its total perimeter in the community of the total church, it would remain abstract if it did not become concrete in everyday relationships. The context in which we are, if we didn't perceive it and live it in the elbow-to-elbow relationship with those to whom the same encounter has happened and been recognized like we did. This concreteness of communion is not a choice, not a particular choice, a more that some add. No, it's the Christian life as such. Where this is lacking, it's the faith that's weakened, that becomes abstract, incapable of affecting life. And this seems a really decisive passage. Giussani says, Catholics today lose their faith so largely, including many theologians. He's speaking back in 68, but I think you could consider this relevant today, because they don't behind them any community life, no experience of the church as a community. And so this is an observation that should make us reflect and also reconsider the way of conceiving and proposing Christianity, reproposing it, yesterday and today. Faith, in fact, is a personal experience, but not a solitary one. Communion and the expression of the communion and the expression of this communion, that is unity, says Giussani, not only makes us a visible sign of his presence in the world, but also makes us discover the faith, nourishes faith in us. And so here Giussani dwells on indicating the dimensions of community with a radicalness that leaves us astounded and has got nothing to envy from that we see in the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, it speaks of the authoritativeness of communion, with respect to which to live an attitude of listening and of dependence, and then of communion of gestures, of goods, a communion of judgment, launching the idea of groups of communion in which these dimensions are made effective, punctual, daily, and can communicate in one's own environment of life. So on this proposal, on this terrain, on this earth, was lived the name of communion and liberation came out. And he says it's the most beautiful formula that we found in all the years of our journey. Communion and therefore liberation. You can't do the other way around, it says Giussani. It's through the communion that we experience the liberation that is Christ, a liberation that our hearts desire and the world awaits. From this springs up an imperative which shows us that communion is both a gift and a task at the same time, a responsibility. Pope Francis said this too in the letter that he sent us in January. Giussani expresses this with a kind of neologism. We want to do communion, whatever might be our future. But I'll come back to this in the third point. Second step, judgment and new culture. So regarding the communion of judgment in particular that I just hinted at, Giussani observes, if I am in communion, the forming of judgment that is at the origin of all my decisions has as its humus, as its ground, the communion itself. A judgment is formed on the basis of criteria and sensitivity. And the place of criteria and sensibilities, within the form which I form my judgment of things, is the communion. It's not for nothing an affirmation we should take for granted. So everything that we normally, the same idea of communion, these are things that people look at with suspicion, perhaps with hostility. So we can say maybe that we, that as children of our time, can feel like this. It's enough to think how the fact that you belong, that you sustain something, can arouse in some way. It could be a grounds for suspicion. So you can also say, goes on Giussani, that my judgment on things, and therefore my decisions, are born and formulated in dialogue with the communion. I want to draw out the reasons for my behavior from the life of this communion. I want to compare and contrast what I do with communion and with its life. And this, he says, becomes in time a normal attitude, becomes a physiognomy, my physiognomy. And this is, he says, how a gaze of faith flourishes. A similar look at the reality of things is an eye that's shaped by the encounter with Christ and the commitment to face all the problems, the situations of existence, in the light of Christ's presence. Hence, Christ who's present as communion. So if faith didn't bring out a different, truer way of seeing oneself and reality, that's more willing to say bread to bread and wine to wine, more open to recognize the meaning of things and grasp their value, it would have no connection with life. It would leave everything exactly as it was before. It would be irrelevant. The categories of judgment, the criteria for decisions, the motives for action would remain the same as those of others. That is, those of the current mentality of the world. But watch out, faith like this could not generate a different outlook if Christ were reduced to an idea, if he were not recognized as a real presence in life, if he did not become in communion a concrete term of comparison, of listening, of following, and therefore of belonging. So let's be clear. We're not talking about eliminating the agent factor, the actor that is conscience, he says. That is the person, the conscious actor. But rather the opposite, to realizing that in the end there are two types of involvement, that of the world and that of Christ. And here the Christian community presents itself as the objective condition so that consciences can develop criteria, can grasp, perceive, clarify exact criteria. And my involvement with it, that is with the communion, is the ground on which this can happen for me. So to the extent of our involvement, of our belonging to the fact of Christ, that faith becomes a criterion for judging the world, and thus becomes a judgment on the world, on what happens to us and on what we see outside and within us. Even within us, yeah? It's fundamental that this passage takes place in us. But Giussani says, a true theory is a life, it's a living reality, always on the move, capable of evolving, of responding to the signs of the times. Not that it must change, contradict itself in its fundamental face, but at a soul, a principle of inner unity continually faces the circumstances, the new situations that are ever new, in which ancient and fundamental perennial needs and requirements of man such as such come to be. It's interesting to note here the harmony with the words that Pope Francis said in St. Peter's Square in October 22. We ran over them well. The potential of your charism is still largely to be discovered. I encourage you to find the right ways and languages so that the charism that Father Giussani has given you reaches new people and new environments so that it can speak to today's world. But in order for the judgment to be formed, for this judgment to be formed, to be expressed, for an expression of cultural position, in addition to the eminence and communion, another factor is needed. This other factor, again, using Giussani's words, is being right down to the marrow of your bones, inside the needs and requirements of humanity, of man, because it's in the relationship and the identifying itself with the needs and requirements of man that its principle, that the event of communion is enriched, that it releases all its insights and all its affirmations, that it clarifies all its perspectives. So the dramatic relationship between these two factors is what makes judgment mature, what gives rise to an adequate cultural position which can offer an original contribution to the world. And I'd like to emphasize that the adventure of judgment, of culture, is a form of witness to the fact of Christ, and it can also meet with incomprehension and hostility from the world. It's not like it's always going to meet consensus everywhere. And as we could already underline in the recent assembly of the Centre of Cultural Centres. Giussani sticks on this aspect in the final lines of the volume. You'll see it when he quotes the letter to the Christians of the West by Joseph Savorana, the greatest Czechoslovakian theologian of the last century, who was persecuted for his faith. He addresses an explicit criticism to the Christians of the West for their acquiescence to worldly ideologies, and revolves everything around the Pauline phrase, do not conform to this age, but be transformed by renewing your mind. Giussani comments, do not conform to the world. Do not take the patterns of others, becoming slaves to it. And this introduces us to the third and final step, the life as mission. I'll try to go. In the 5th chapter of the book, Giussani urges us to take a new step. The problem, he says, is that the reality of the mystery of Christ that we've encountered, in which we say we believe, this still remains a reality that's outside of us, he says, a discourse outside of us. Now, all this must become, he says before, like Professor said, self-awareness. The reality to which we say we adhere, in whose name we move, must become, and he's using words, strong words here, the structure of my brain, of my heart, of my sensibility, my spirit, my body. This is the true identification with Christ. Sure, that speech, that word is a word about me, and that reality is me. This is conversion, the passage to a new self-consciousness. The content of our self-awareness is an other who is me. It's the mystery of Christ. It's his fact that's present in history, which involves all the people that Christ has called together, together with me. If we don't nourish this self-awareness, he says, we lose our way. We lose our bearings, we lose our categories, we lose our face. But how can this self-awareness be sustained, be nourished? Here it says there's a providential vicious circle. It's in the community that this edification takes place. It's through the community that we are born, and it's in the community that we edify ourselves. So the phenomenon of this conversion, of this transformation, and here's the point that I'm interested in highlighting now, this is called mission. It's not all a matter of initiatives to do, of works, of activities to carry out. It's life itself that is mission. If self-consciousness is different, if I'm a different man, this diversity, this phenomena of this difference is mission. But the sense of mission, if you do not have it, first of all, in the most everyday relationships with wife, friends, in the places where you live, then you can't have it for society or for politics, for culture or work. You can't have it. Conversely, you can have it if you have it in the elementary relationships of your life. So mission, he says, defines the dynamic of life with that wholeness that is indicated in St. Paul's phrase quoted by Giussani, whether you eat, whether you drink, whether you sleep, whether you're awake. And if it's not so global, it's not true. The concept of mission is not true. It's not true self-awareness. It's not Christian life. But if it is global, of course, it reaches the wife and the child, but it also reaches politics and social commitment and work in the factory. In short, it impacts the whole of life without delimitation of dimensions and ambits. And what does it mean that life is a mission? I'll conclude. It means living everything with a consciousness of being sent there by the Father and bring the fact of Christ and therefore the fact of Christian communion wherever we go. Behold, we too, in the wake and in the example of Don Giussani, in the immanence of the Christian companionship that was born from him, we desire that our life be spent for this, because there's nothing that's more fascinating and dramatically corresponding than to bring the fact of Christ and therefore the fact of Christian communion wherever one goes. The first fruit of all this is a new subject in history, a new personality, whose characteristic, his fundamental characteristic, is an untamable heart. We've seen many exhibitions this time, including the one about our dear Enzo Piccinini. Untamed because it's free, because it's determined exclusively by the single love of our life, Christ. A subject that does not fear the judgment of others, if not of his own great love. I'm reminded of what Bernadette Soubirous used to say when they asked her to convince them to believe in the apparitions at Lourdes, a fact that's difficult for natural reason to accept. She responded with the simplicity of a child, totally entrusted to her great love, and therefore never discouraged by the lack of recognition from others. I'm not in charge of making you believe. I'm in charge of telling you. Thank you.
Professoressa Giussani.
Professor, if this certainty expressed in such a warm way has attracted us, has involved us, we belong to it, we accept it, does it still prevail among Christians in other moments? You know, against evident problems when faced with immense effort. Even, you know, when people feel disillusioned, they resign themselves in a sense of impotence. You know, maybe people don't listen, it's complicated, they don't want to do things. You know, how do you convince people? So movements in the church today, now, it seems so difficult, you know, relating to what we've spoken about earlier. What role can these movements have now? Because maybe some people think that times have changed, that they're not needed anymore. Thank you for this question. I'd say it's truly worth reading this book, because within it are compiled some writings of Don Giussani, who lived in a period of tremendous skepticism, which is different to that which we're facing now, but because that was a very oppositional skepticism against authority, against tradition, against rules. It was one of great resistance, and it was very ideological. But all things being considered, even if it's very different at the roots to what it is today, it's still a group of people who lived a daily struggle against skepticism. Today, we live what Pope Francis has always called a great change in the era. Ours is a skepticism that's perhaps more difficult to grasp, because it's not quite so oppositional. It's also it's marked by fluidity, by people who don't care anymore, and it's a different challenge to that which we're facing now. If we look back at those times where everyone came from a context that was fundamentally Christian, there were some Christian values at the end of everything tied to family. Today, for many, this isn't the case. You mentioned the post-Christian man, and we are aware of this. So something comes to mind, a couple of words that Cardinal Ratzinger at the time said in the preface of a volume of some of Don Giussani's works. So to summarize the thought of Don Giussani in at that time, Cardinal Ratzinger wrote about the utopia opposed to Christianity. Utopia, all things considered, has led to having some empty sort of ghosts, which pull you away from reality, whereas Christianity proposes you facts, an event, an encounter. Today we've spoken about that plenty, a presence. We're speaking about religious movements here, obviously, and we think about those movements that emerged in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They had this role of bearing witness to a presence, bearing witness to what matters, that searching after your reason to find an encounter with Christ that can transform your life and can raise you up, and that it should be proclaimed. So this historic task of the movements in those years particularly, their mission didn't expire today. It's one that urges us to face our reality properly. Back in the day, they had the task of proclaiming to people the Christianity, of launching it in a new way, of bringing Christ and the experience of Christ with a new language, with new methods. And today, it's not any less, but the challenge now, and Professor Prosperi has quoted Pope Francis in the 15th of October of 2022, that it consists in knowing the men and women of today, of supporting them, of listening to them, of standing by their side, and then proposing to them with a new suitable language, nothing less than Christ himself. That's what movements have to proclaim. It's not a question of inventing new recipes, but of proposing nothing less than the Christian message in this fluidity, this post-fluidity, as you said. If you'll allow me, the great challenge of the movements is to keep alive that missionary sense, which makes it so that they're not only here to preserve and live nostalgically with words and texts and experiences that have been lived in the past. The challenge is to, while remaining faithful to the content of our faith, to what the charism of each one upholds, it's that of being able to dialogue, of being open to encounter people, to get involved with the men and women of today, not preserving a status quo, but but launching yourself in a new missionary sense of a new evangelization that covers a fundamental aspect. I like ending on what Paul VI said in his in his writings. He said, contemporary men prefer to listen to witnesses as opposed to masters, to teachers. If they listen to teachers, it's because they are witnesses of something. And I think Don Giussani indubitably is a great teacher. And thus his company of friends has been followed, and now as a movement asks to be followed as witnesses before rather than as teachers. Thank you. Professor, one quick thing because we're really running out of time here. Professor Belardinelli, you've said many beautiful things that need to be looked at properly and delved into, but in terms of judgment, that word that you used, because Professor Prosperi mentioned it as well as a cultural position. We've spoken about culture now and its important aspect in the faith. There's often an ambiguity among Christians, which, is not talking of not get down the road of relativism, but it's to understand the difference between judgment and prejudice, which we can look, how can we tell when we have too much prejudice in this sense? It's a difficult question. I think that every judgment in the prospect of this book that we're discussing, in some way, with a lot of realism, it is told us that it's prejudice. The idea is, what type of it is it? What else are we building? What is this vision that we're putting at the foundation of what we say? One thing is putting love for Christ as the foundation of our judgment. Another thing is putting other masters, let's call it this way. There's Don Giussani has a nugget of wisdom on this front, which is interesting because if we don't follow Christ, we inevitably put ourselves in the wake of something else, which doesn't work for our freedom. Even Christian judgment can become something that distances you. It can become a structure that doesn't have within it any life. It can happen in history. It has happened. I spoke of Europe earlier. If there's a place of Christianity that's been diffused and of judgments that have been inspired by Christianity, it's certainly Europe that's the bastion of it. Except that Europe now, let's say the truth I mentioned earlier, Europe has become simply a parasite of the Christian judgment that generated it. In the sense that we have structures, we have inclinations, but we don't have the vitalizing power of Christianity, the revitalizing power of Christ. This is the key point. Perhaps we do well to ask ourselves every time, what is the profound inspiration of our judgment? Because Christianity is, Davide mentioned it earlier, Christianity is the generation of another way of looking at reality. This is sure, this is a fact. It's a new consciousness, and as far as this new self-awareness, to make it ours, and to make it a fountain of judgments on reality, only reality can teach this to us. We can't say it before the fact, and others have told us as well. Thank you. If you excuse the rush, just one thing, Prosperi. I happened to look at these texts, and here we piece together something that's worth mentioning. that we want to publish this right now. I'll be very brief because I used too much time earlier. It's the second thing you mentioned. We have a desire that comes from this. Giussani said many things. He wrote a great deal. He did many things, which, how can I say, he almost fired the starting pistol to a great number of things that were launched from then, and as the Pope said, that we've still got so much to discover. Not only in what's happened in the past, the problem is that all these things, in one way or another, find their own trajectory in the description of a lived experience that is the Christian one, according to a method to understand the Christian experience, which is for everyone. So, for this reason, all of this which has happened in a particular historic moment, so to answering particular questions, points to some universal facts that are that value today. What we deduced back then has continued to grow until today, as you've seen. The meeting where we are today is one of those many forms of expression that was founded in the past. But so it has that origin as at the core of its self-awareness. So this moment is the moment in which Giussani realizes that the initial experiences begun on school desks, proposed to high school students, to not have them lose lose the appeal of their faith. It's still possible to trace the trajectory of a life, to continue acquiring new maturity of an adult experience, and that's how CL was born. If we now don't want to, not only to re-understand, to relearn what Giussani had in mind when he had this intuition, but what was the integral factor of the proposal he made, that through his own personal journey, along with those, the communion, those with whom he lived, if we don't relive for ourselves this fact, how will we continue to go ahead to lead an experience, but our hearts will cease to beat? So, this is only a beginning. To this volume, there will be others after it, because there's a whole list of things that still need to be discovered. Thank you. Thank you, Alberto Savorana, to Linda Lisoni, Davide Prosperi, to Sergio Belardinelli. Thank you to all of you for listening to us, and thank you for participating. Thank you to all the volunteers. You're going to have to quickly set up the room for the next conference, but please remember that there are some stations around the meeting marked with a heart that say Dona Ora, because the meeting is made by all of us, by all those people who participate, who've been invited, who work here, and who live these encounters. In particular, I'd like to remind you that in these days where great uncertainties and great unknowns make us think about how to build dialogue and peace, I'd like to remind you all of what Cardinal Pizzaballa told us at the first encounter, that the meeting will donate part of the donations received over the course of this week to humanitarian emergencies in the Holy Land. It's one more reason to go and visit the people who have the Dona Ora T-shirt, where the heart is marked, and to go and donate. Thank you.
civiltà dell'amore. Fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene. Si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
Vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene,